For most of human history, survival depended on one fragile assumption that the world, while dangerous, was at least predictable. Storms came in seasons, crops failed for reasons that could be traced, empires rose and fell according to patterns scholars later claimed to understand. Even chaos had rhythm. The mind learned to map reality, not perfectly, but well enough to navigate it without constant terror. We trusted that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, and that the rules governing existence, though sometimes hidden, were stable. That assumption is now cracking. Across every domain, politics, economics, technology, culture, psychology, the familiar laws appear to be failing. Outcomes contradict models. Predictions collapse in public. Events that should be rare become common, while the inevitable never arrives. The old signposts no longer point anywhere reliable. Reality, it seems, has stopped obeying its own rules. The first sign is not catastrophe, it is confusion. People notice that explanations feel thinner, forecasts grow shorter, hedged with disclaimers. Experts hesitate before finishing sentences. Institutions revise statements not after years, but after days. The public senses something without fully naming it. The world is no longer behaving the way it is supposed to, not dramatically wrong, but subtly, persistently off. At first, this discomfort is easy to dismiss. Every generation believes it lives in exceptional times. Every crisis feels unprecedented while it lasts. But there is a difference between turbulence inside a system and turbulence of the system itself. When rules fail locally, order can be restored. When rules fail globally, orientation disappears. Orientation is what the human mind depends on most. Long before science, philosophy, or mathematics, the brain evolved as a prediction engine. It does not seek truth, it seeks stability. It builds internal models of the world so it can move without fear, choose without paralysis, and survive without constant vigilance. When the model works, life feels coherent. When the model fails, anxiety becomes permanent. This is not merely intellectual discomfort, it is existential destabilization. Consider how deeply modern life depends on invisible predictions. Markets price the future. Governments legislate for decades ahead. Algorithms recommend what we should want next. Medicine calculates risk. Education prepares children for worlds not yet built. Every institution rests on the belief that tomorrow will resemble today in at least some structured way. Now watch what happens when that belief erodes. Economic systems reward behavior that once guaranteed failure. Stability punishes caution. Long-term planning collapses under short-term shocks. Careers become fragile. Social norms reverse themselves within a generation. Technologies emerge faster than ethics can interpret them. Cultural values swing violently between extremes, unable to settle into consensus. Nothing breaks spectacularly. Instead, everything drifts. The deeper problem is not that events are unpredictable. The deeper problem is that the mechanisms of unpredictability are themselves unclear. In the past, randomness had boundaries. Today, randomness seems structural, not noise around a stable pattern, but noise replacing the pattern itself. This is when the phrase, "experts have no explanation," begins to circulate. Not because experts are ignorant, but because the systems they study have crossed thresholds beyond linear reasoning. Complexity has reached a point where causation fragments. Small triggers produce enormous effects. Feedback loops amplify errors. Interdependencies multiply faster than models can track. What once could be understood through equations now behaves more like weather, except without seasons. And weather, at least, still follows physics. The collapse of rules produces a strange social phenomenon. Confidence survives longer than understanding. People continue speaking with certainty long after their frameworks have failed, not because they believe, but because admitting uncertainty threatens their identity. Authority depends on coherence, and coherence depends on rules. When rules vanish, authority becomes performance. This is why contradictions now coexist without embarrassment. Data can prove and disprove the same claim. Policies can succeed and fail simultaneously depending on which metric is chosen. Narratives change mid-sentence. History is rewritten in real time. Logic becomes optional. The public adapts not by seeking clarity, but by lowering expectations of consistency. At this stage, many mistake the problem for moral decay, political polarization, or technological disruption. These are symptoms, not causes. The underlying disturbance is epistemological. The relationship between perception and reality has weakened. Reality is no longer slow enough for understanding to catch it. Information moves faster than reflection. Decisions precede comprehension. Consequences appear before motives are examined. By the time explanations form, conditions have already shifted. The world becomes a sequence of reactions without narratives, events without meaning. This is not chaos in the cinematic sense. There are no burning cities, no collapsing skies. The danger is quieter. The danger is the gradual erosion of the mind's ability to tell what matters. When rules disappear, priorities dissolve. If effort no longer predicts reward, discipline loses value. If truth no longer predicts influence, honesty becomes optional. If competence no longer predicts authority, hierarchy becomes theatrical. People adapt rationally to irrational systems. They learn to optimize visibility over substance, speed over accuracy, certainty over humility. This adaptation feels like corruption, but it is survival. Yet survival under inverted rules has a psychological cost. The first cost is chronic anxiety. When the future cannot be modeled, the nervous system never fully relaxes. Hypervigilance becomes normal. People refresh news compulsively, not to learn, but to detect threat. Sleep fragments. Attention shortens. Memory weakens. The mind lives permanently in provisional mode, unable to commit to long horizons. The second cost is cynicism. Once people realize that explanations routinely fail, they stop seeking them. They interpret coherence as manipulation and confusion as honesty. Skepticism hardens into nihilism. If nothing makes sense, nothing deserves loyalty. Institutions lose legitimacy not through scandal, but through incoherence. The third cost is identity erosion. Most identities are built on narratives of progress, career paths, moral arcs, social roles, personal trajectories. When rules fail, narratives collapse. People no longer know what kind of person the world rewards, punishes, or ignores. Values become unstable. Aspirations shrink. Meaning retreats inward. And this leads to the most dangerous consequence: the quiet acceptance of absurdity. Humans can endure almost any hardship if they believe it follows a pattern. They can survive war, poverty, exile, even suffering, as long as they can explain it. But when suffering becomes random, success arbitrary, and failure inexplicable, the mind loses its anchor. At this point, people do not revolt. They withdraw. They lower expectations. They detach emotionally. They treat reality as entertainment rather than responsibility. Irony replaces conviction. Spectatorship replaces citizenship. The world becomes something that happens to them, not something they participate in shaping. This is how civilizations decay without noticing, not through invasion or collapse, but through epistemic fatigue, the exhaustion of trying to understand a world that no longer explains itself. Yet, there is a deeper layer beneath even this. What if reality has not changed, but our models have simply reached their limits? For centuries, human progress was driven by reductionism, breaking complex phenomena into simpler parts. Physics, biology, economics, psychology, all advanced by isolating variables and controlling conditions. This method worked spectacularly as long as systems remained loosely coupled. But modern civilization has become hyper-connected. Technology links markets, politics, culture, and psychology into dense networks. Actions propagate instantly across continents. Feedback loops multiply. Non-linear effects dominate. The system no longer behaves like a machine. It behaves like an ecosystem, except one evolving faster than cognition. In ecosystems, rules exist, but they are probabilistic, emergent, and local. No single law governs the whole. Stability arises not from control, but from balance. When balance is lost, no equation can predict restoration. We may be living through the moment when human analytical capacity falls behind the complexity of its own creations. If so, experts have no explanation. Is not a temporary failure. It is a structural condition. This does not mean the world is meaningless. It means meaning can no longer be outsourced. In earlier eras, religion provided cosmology, science provided causality, institutions provided narratives. Today, all three struggle to maintain coherence. The responsibility for orientation shifts inward. Individuals must construct local rules in a global disorder. This is not empowerment. It is burden. To live without reliable rules is to live without guarantees. No path assures success. No belief guarantees protection. No identity guarantees belonging. One must operate with provisional truths, adaptive ethics, and flexible goals. And yet, within this instability lies a strange clarity. When reality stops obeying its own rules, illusions become visible. False authorities lose credibility. Empty rituals lose power. Inherited narratives fracture. What remains are fundamentals: attention, discipline, perception, resilience. The skills that matter are no longer technical, but psychological. Not prediction, but preparation. Not certainty, but adaptability. The mind must learn a new posture. Not mastery, but navigation. Instead of asking what will happen, the wiser question becomes, how will I respond? Instead of building rigid plans, one builds elastic strategies. Instead of trusting systems, one cultivates internal stability. This is not pessimism, it is realism at a higher resolution. The world may never return to obeying simple rules. Complexity, once unleashed, does not retreat. The age of stable explanations may be over. What replaces it is not chaos, but a different order, one that cannot be summarized, only inhabited. The tragedy is that most will continue waiting for coherence to return. They will wait for experts to regain confidence, for institutions to restore clarity, for narratives to stabilize. They will wait for rules that no longer exist. And while they wait, the world will continue moving, indifferent, adaptive, unmapped. Those who survive this era will not be the smartest, the strongest, or the most informed. They will be the ones who accept without bitterness that reality has changed, and who learn to stand upright even when the ground refuses to stay still. This is the first lesson of an upside-down world. When reality stops obeying its own rules, the only remaining law is the one you impose upon yourself. For centuries, authority was built on a simple exchange. Society granted trust, and experts delivered explanations. Kings ruled by divine right, priests interpreted the cosmos, scientists decoded nature, economists mapped prosperity, and institutions promised stability. Even when they failed within a framework that still felt coherent. Errors were corrected, models were refined. Progress, though uneven, appeared directional. That arrangement is now dissolving, not in dramatic revolutions or visible purges, but in a quieter erosion, the slow fading of credibility. Authority still speaks, but fewer people listen. Experts still publish, but their words carry less weight. Institutions still issue statements, but these statements now feel provisional, hedged, temporary. The silence that follows is not ignorance. It is uncertainty exposed. The first sign of collapse is hesitation. Where experts once spoke with confidence, they now qualify every claim. Forecasts are layered with probabilities, disclaimers, and escape clauses. Reports avoid firm conclusions. Press conferences emphasize what is not known more than what is. This caution is intellectually honest, but psychologically destabilizing. Societies do not depend on precision, they depend on direction. When direction disappears, anxiety rushes in. In earlier eras, errors did not destroy authority because the framework remained intact. A physician might misdiagnose, but medicine still worked. An economist might miss a recession, but markets still followed cycles. A scientist might revise a theory, but the method still promised truth. Today, the frameworks themselves wobble. Economic models fail to predict crises that emerge from obscure interactions. Political science cannot anticipate social explosions driven by online dynamics. Epidemiology collides with behavior. Climate projections shift with every new dataset. Artificial intelligence evolves faster than regulation can define it. Each discipline encounters boundaries not at the edges, but at the center. The more complex the world becomes, the narrower expertise grows. Specialists know more and more about less and less. Their authority becomes deep but fragile. Powerful inside narrow domains, irrelevant outside them. Meanwhile, real problems refuse to stay inside disciplinary borders. Economic crises are political, technological, psychological, and cultural at once. Pandemics are biological, social, informational, and ethical simultaneously. Climate change is scientific, economic, geopolitical, and existential. No single expert can see the whole, and when no one sees the whole, no one can lead with confidence. This is not merely a technical failure, it is a structural one. Authority once rested on the assumption that reality could be segmented, studied, and mastered. That assumption no longer holds. Systems have become reflexive. They change in response to being studied. Predictions alter behavior, which alters outcomes, which invalidates predictions. The observer disturbs the system. Knowledge destabilizes what it seeks to explain. In such conditions, silence becomes rational. Experts retreat not because they lack intelligence, but because every statement risks immediate contradiction. Any claim becomes obsolete before it circulates. Every conclusion invites politicization. Every nuance is compressed into slogans. Speaking becomes dangerous, not physically, but reputationally. Reputation is now more fragile than truth. A single incorrect forecast can destroy decades of credibility. An honest uncertainty can be framed as incompetence. A cautious revision can be weaponized as deception. The incentive shifts from accuracy to survivability. Better to say nothing than to be proven wrong publicly. Thus emerges the age of strategic silence. Official reports become deliberately vague. Forecast windows shrink. Language softens. Responsibility diffuses across committees. No one owns conclusions. No one stands behind predictions. Authority becomes bureaucratic rather than personal. Documents without faces, statements without authors. This protects institutions but weakens trust. The public senses avoidance even when it cannot articulate it. When explanations feel evasive, suspicion grows. When timelines shift without clarity, confidence erodes. When recommendations reverse without narrative, legitimacy collapses. People do not demand infallibility. They demand coherence. And coherence is precisely what modern complexity destroys. The collapse of authority triggers a second phenomenon, the migration of trust. When traditional experts hesitate, attention flows elsewhere, to commentators, influencers, ideologues, entrepreneurs, mystics, and rebels. Not because they are more accurate, but because they are more decisive. In uncertainty, confidence becomes more persuasive than competence. This is not stupidity. It is psychology. The human nervous system interprets certainty as safety. A wrong map is preferable to no map. A false explanation calms more than an honest void. When official voices speak cautiously, unofficial voices fill the vacuum with conviction, and conviction spreads faster than evidence. Social platforms reward clarity over complexity, emotion over nuance, outrage over restraint. Algorithms amplify certainty, not humility. The marketplace of ideas evolves into a marketplace of confidence. Those willing to oversimplify dominate discourse. Those who hesitate disappear. Experts become invisible not because they are wrong, but because they are slow. Slow to verify, slow to contextualize, slow to revise. In a world where narratives travel instantly, truth arrives late and is often ignored. This produces a tragic inversion. The more responsible an expert becomes, the less influential they are. The more cautious their language, the weaker their authority. The more transparent their uncertainty, the more replaceable they seem. Eventually, authority no longer belongs to those who understand, but to those who perform understanding. This performance creates a new class of figures, pseudo-experts. They master the aesthetics of knowledge without its discipline. They cite selectively, explain confidently, predict boldly, revise silently. Their authority rests not on accuracy but on narrative control. They are never fully wrong because their claims are elastic. They are never accountable because their audiences reward belief, not verification. In this environment, traditional expertise looks timid, and so the collapse accelerates. Institutions attempt to restore trust through communication strategies, transparency campaigns, and ethical frameworks. But trust cannot be manufactured. It emerges from repeated alignment between prediction and outcome. When alignment becomes rare, no messaging can compensate. The deeper problem is not misinformation. It is the absence of stable reference points. In earlier eras, disagreement still occurred within shared frameworks. Competing theories accepted common standards of evidence. Political opponents recognized common facts. Scientific debates unfolded inside methodological boundaries. Now, even frameworks fragment. Different groups inhabit different realities, curated by algorithms and reinforced by identity. Evidence becomes partisan. Expertise becomes tribal. Authority becomes ideological. Trust depends not on competence, but on affiliation. At this point, the silence of experts becomes almost ethical. To speak into polarized systems is to be misused. Nuance is amputated. Context is stripped. Quotes are weaponized. Data becomes propaganda. Many experts retreat not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Better to remain silent than to feed distortion. Yet this silence has consequences. When legitimate authority withdraws, illegitimate authority expands. When careful voices fade, reckless ones dominate. When institutions hesitate, demagogues surge. The vacuum does not remain empty. It fills with noise. Societies then misdiagnose the problem. They blame education, media, politics, technology, or culture. These are vectors, not causes. The root disturbance lies deeper: the loss of epistemic hierarchy, the inability to distinguish reliable knowledge from persuasive storytelling. Once this distinction erodes, authority becomes unstable by definition. No reform can easily restore it. For authority is not merely institutional, it is psychological. People follow authority when they believe three things: that the authority understands reality, that it acts in good faith, and that it can deliver outcomes. When any of these fail persistently, trust collapses. When all three fail simultaneously, authority becomes ceremonial. We may already be there. Governments issue policies they cannot enforce. Economists explain outcomes they did not foresee. Scientists revise models faster than the public can absorb them. Corporations promise ethics they cannot implement. Media narrates events it no longer shapes. No one lies consistently. Everyone fails intermittently. And intermittent failure is more corrosive than constant failure because it destroys calibration. People cannot learn whom to trust if accuracy fluctuates unpredictably. They respond by trusting no one, or by trusting whoever confirms their prior beliefs. Thus emerges the final stage of collapse: privatized authority. Each individual constructs their own panel of experts, drawn not from competence but from alignment. Truth becomes personalized. Authority becomes customizable. Reality fragments into parallel interpretations, each internally coherent, externally incompatible. At this point, the phrase "experts have no explanation" acquires its final meaning. Not that experts lack answers, but that no answer is collectively binding. Even when correct explanations exist, they no longer unify behavior. Knowledge loses coordinating power. Societies become collections of private maps, navigating a shared terrain with incompatible compasses. This is how large systems fail, not through error, but through incoherence. Yet within this collapse lies an uncomfortable insight. Perhaps authority was always more fragile than we admitted. Perhaps expertise functioned not because it was perfect, but because the world was simpler. Fewer variables, slower change, narrower interactions. Under such conditions, models worked well enough. Institutions appeared wise. Predictions felt reliable. As complexity exploded, the limits of cognition became visible. No mind, no discipline, no institution can fully grasp the systems now shaping existence. Authority did not decay morally. It hit a cognitive ceiling. If so, the silence of experts is not cowardice. It is honesty. And the collapse of authority is not a tragedy. It is a transition. The age of centralized explanation may be ending. In its place emerges a harsher requirement: distributed responsibility. Individuals must learn to evaluate uncertainty, compare sources, tolerate ambiguity, and act without guarantees. This is not empowering in the inspirational sense. It is exhausting, but it may be necessary. For in a world too complex to be mastered, authority cannot be restored by louder voices or stricter institutions. It can only be rebuilt through humility, adaptation, and the slow reconstruction of trust at smaller scales. Until then, silence will persist, not as absence, but as the sound of knowledge reaching the limits of what it can promise. Civilizations are built on invisible hierarchies, not merely social hierarchies of power and wealth, but moral, intellectual, and behavioral hierarchies that define what should be rewarded and what should be restrained. For long periods of history, these hierarchies remain relatively stable. Discipline tends to outperform impulse. Competence tends to outrank spectacle. Truth, while often delayed, eventually overtakes noise. Then something subtle changes. Not a revolution, not a collapse, but a quiet reversal. The signals flip. The behaviors once punished become profitable. The virtues once honored become liabilities. The traits that once indicated failure begin to correlate with success. Inversion begins. At first, it appears temporary. A few anomalies here and there. A reckless leader rises unexpectedly. A shallow idea spreads faster than a rigorous one. A scandal fails to end a career. Observers dismiss these as exceptions. Every system produces outliers. Every era tolerates contradictions. But inversion does not announce itself as disorder. It presents itself as adaptation. As complexity increases and systems strain, survival no longer favors the most accurate, but the most adaptive. Not the most truthful, but the most visible. Not the most principled, but the most flexible. The environment changes faster than values can adjust, and selection pressures shift accordingly. What once signaled competence now signals vulnerability. Silence becomes weakness. Caution becomes indecision. Depth becomes irrelevance. Integrity becomes rigidity. In contrast, confidence becomes currency. Speed becomes intelligence. Visibility becomes authority. Certainty becomes influence. This is not moral decline. It is evolutionary logic. In unstable environments, organisms that hesitate die. Organisms that signal boldly survive, even if they signal falsely. The system does not reward truth. It rewards survivability. Modern civilization is now such an environment. Information flows faster than verification. Reputation travels faster than performance. Markets move faster than understanding. Social narratives mutate faster than institutions can regulate. In this velocity, accuracy becomes expensive. Delay becomes fatal. Reflection becomes a competitive disadvantage. Thus, inversion accelerates. The thoughtful fall behind. The reckless surge ahead. The quiet are ignored. The loud dominate. The cautious are labeled obsolete. The impulsive are celebrated as visionary. Competence, which requires time, loses to confidence, which requires only assertion. This reversal is most visible in leadership. Historically, leaders were selected, imperfectly, but not randomly, for experience, restraint, and judgment. Even tyrants often rose through discipline and strategic intelligence. Today, leadership selection increasingly favors visibility, emotional resonance, and narrative control. The leader need not solve problems. They need only perform solutions. They need not understand systems. They need only project certainty. They need not predict accurately. They need only revise convincingly. The more complex the system becomes, the less leadership requires competence, and the more it requires theater. This produces a paradox. As challenges grow harder, leaders grow simpler. Slogans replace strategies. Symbolism replaces substance. Personality replaces policy. Performance replaces governance. Those capable of managing complexity are sidelined as boring, cautious, or elitist. Those incapable of managing complexity thrive because they never acknowledge it. Inversion spreads beyond leadership into every domain. In economics, speculation outperforms production. Leverage beats labor. Narrative beats fundamentals. Markets reward speed over sustainability, disruption over stability, volatility over value. Long-term builders are undercut by short-term extractors. Success increasingly detaches from contribution. In culture, provocation outperforms. Insight, controversy outperforms craft. Algorithms reward outrage, not wisdom. The artist who disturbs gains more attention than the artist who refines. Complexity is compressed into slogans. Subtlety is penalized as forgettable. In science, publication quantity competes with research quality. Visibility competes with rigor. Funding rewards fashionable hypotheses more than patient investigation. The incentive shifts from discovery to productivity. Knowledge becomes industrial. In morality, performance outperforms character. Public virtue substitutes for private discipline. Signaling replaces sacrifice. Reputation becomes currency. Ethics becomes branding. None of this requires conspiracy. It emerges naturally from incentives. Systems reward what they can measure. Modern systems can easily measure clicks, views, engagement, speed, volume, and growth. They struggle to measure wisdom, judgment, depth, resilience, and integrity. What cannot be measured is devalued. What can be measured is optimized. Thus, inversion is baked into the architecture. The consequences unfold quietly. First, standards collapse. When noise outperforms signal, the threshold for attention drops. When spectacle dominates, excellence becomes invisible. When speed is rewarded, error multiplies. Quality degrades not because people reject it, but because systems stop recognizing it. Second, trust erodes. When incompetence prospers, people lose faith in merit. When manipulation succeeds, people assume dishonesty is universal. When hypocrisy goes unpunished, cynicism hardens. Trust once broken is rarely restored by reform. It decays into permanent suspicion. Third, identity destabilizes. People no longer know which traits to cultivate. Should one be honest or strategic, patient or aggressive, disciplined or adaptive? The environment sends contradictory signals. Role models contradict virtues. Success stories undermine ethics. In such ambiguity, many choose imitation over conviction. They copy whatever currently works, regardless of long-term cost. Values become transactional. This is when inversion becomes self-sustaining. Once enough people adapt to reversed incentives, the environment itself transforms. Institutions normalize dysfunction. Media normalizes spectacle. Markets normalize volatility. Education normalizes superficiality. What began as deviation becomes baseline. The abnormal becomes ordinary. At this stage, even those who recognize inversion struggle to resist it. To act with integrity is to risk irrelevance. To pursue depth is to accept invisibility. To speak carefully is to be drowned out. To plan long-term is to be outcompeted short-term. The environment punishes resistance. This is why inversion is so difficult to reverse. Not because people do not see it, but because survival now depends on it. And yet, inversion has limits. Systems can tolerate distortion for long periods, but not indefinitely. When competence is systematically undervalued, infrastructure decays. When truth is systematically ignored, errors accumulate. When ethics is systematically replaced by performance, legitimacy collapses. Eventually, consequences outpace narratives. Bridges fail, economies fracture, technologies misfire, institutions implode. At that moment, societies suddenly rediscover the value of the very traits they discarded: discipline, expertise, restraint, honesty. But by then, the supply of those traits is scarce. This is the tragic rhythm of inversion. Civilizations oscillate between valuing substance and valuing appearance. Periods of stability reward depth. Periods of turbulence reward adaptability. Over time, adaptability mutates into opportunism, opportunism into corruption, corruption into collapse. Collapse then restores respect for competence, briefly, until the cycle begins again. What makes the current era unique is scale and speed. Never before have inversion dynamics operated globally, instantaneously, and algorithmically. Incentives now shift across billions of people in real time. Cultural reversals propagate within weeks. Entire value systems mutate within a generation. There is no safe periphery, no isolated community, no slow buffer. Inversion becomes universal. Yet within this reversal lies a final irony. The traits devalued by inverted systems are precisely those required to survive their collapse. When volatility peaks, speed becomes liability. When noise overwhelms, silence becomes advantage. When spectacle exhausts, substance becomes refuge. When trust evaporates, character becomes capital. Those who preserved depth while it was unfashionable become indispensable when crisis arrives. History repeatedly confirms this. Empires decay through theatrical leadership and recover through technocratic repair. Economies inflate through speculation and stabilize through discipline. Cultures rot through narcissism and renew through restraint. The cycle does not eliminate inversion. It merely shifts which traits are inverted. Thus, the wise response is not nostalgia or rebellion. It is selective alignment. To understand which inversions are temporary and which are structural. To play the game where necessary without becoming defined by it. To cultivate invisible strengths while navigating visible incentives. To build internal hierarchies when external hierarchies are corrupted. For when inversion becomes the new normal, survival no longer belongs to the virtuous or the ruthless. It belongs to the adaptive without illusion, those who can operate within distorted systems without internalizing their values, those who can perform without believing, compete without corrupting, succeed without surrendering. This is the discipline of inverted eras, not purity, but strategic integrity, to remain anchored while the signals flip, to remember that what is rewarded is not always what endures, and to prepare quietly for the moment when the world, exhausted by its own reversals, begins once again to search for the very virtues it so confidently discarded. The human mind was not designed for chaos, not the dramatic chaos of storms or disasters, but the quieter, more corrosive kind, the absence of meaning. From the earliest moments of consciousness, survival depended not only on reacting, but on understanding. The brain evolved to detect patterns, infer causes, and predict outcomes. Long before language, long before philosophy, the nervous system learned a simple rule: if you can explain what happens, you can survive what happens. Explanation is not a luxury, it is a biological necessity. When an animal understands why danger appears, it learns when to flee and when to rest. When a human understands why crops fail, they adjust seasons, tools, and rituals. When a society understands why plagues spread, it builds sanitation, medicine, and norms. Explanation turns fear into strategy. Meaning turns panic into preparation. Now imagine what happens when explanations disappear, not because events stop occurring, but because causes fragment beyond comprehension, because models contradict themselves, because predictions fail publicly, because narratives change faster than memory, because every theory is provisional, every forecast reversible, every certainty temporary. This is not ignorance, it is epistemic deprivation, the psychological state of living without reliable stories about how the world works. At first, the mind resists. It searches harder, it consumes more information, it refreshes news compulsively, it compares sources obsessively, it debates endlessly. The brain attempts to rebuild coherence by volume, hoping that enough data will eventually assemble into understanding. But data is not explanation. More information without structure increases confusion. Contradictory evidence paralyzes inference. Endless updates erode memory. The mind becomes saturated but not oriented. This produces the first symptom: chronic anxiety. Anxiety is not fear of danger, it is fear of uncertainty. When the nervous system cannot predict outcomes, it activates permanently. Cortisol rises, sleep fragments, attention narrows. The body prepares for threats that never fully materialize. People feel restless without knowing why. They sense danger without seeing it. They anticipate loss without knowing what to protect. This anxiety is diffuse, not tied to any single event, a background hum of unease. Over time, it reshapes personality. People become irritable, vigilant, impatient. They avoid long-term commitments. They postpone decisions. They hedge emotionally. They remain half-ready to flee from lives they no longer trust. The second symptom is cognitive fatigue. The brain spends enormous energy maintaining internal models of reality. When those models fail repeatedly, updating them becomes costly. Each revision demands attention, memory, and emotional regulation. In unstable environments, models must be rebuilt constantly. Eventually, the brain tires. It simplifies. Nuance collapses into binaries. Complexity compresses into slogans. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. People prefer clear errors to unclear truths. They cling to rigid beliefs not because they are convincing, but because they are restful. This is not stupidity. It is conservation. The exhausted mind trades accuracy for stability. The third symptom is narrative hunger. Humans cannot live without stories. When official explanations falter, unofficial ones flourish. Conspiracy theories, ideologies, mythologies, spiritual frameworks, and grand narratives multiply, not because they are true, but because they restore causality. They assign villains, motives, trajectories, and endings. Even false meaning is better than no meaning. At least false meaning offers structure. At least it tells you where to stand. At least it promises that events follow intention. In this environment, the most persuasive narratives are not the most accurate, but the most emotionally coherent. They explain suffering. They identify enemies. They predict redemption. They flatter identity. They reduce complexity into moral theater. The mind accepts them gratefully, but narrative hunger has a cost. Once people adopt explanations for emotional reasons, evidence becomes secondary. Contradictions are reinterpreted as confirmation. Doubt becomes betrayal. Belief becomes identity. Disagreement becomes threat. The absence of explanation thus paradoxically breeds fanaticism. The fourth symptom is learned helplessness. When actions no longer produce predictable outcomes, motivation collapses. Psychologists observed this phenomenon in controlled experiments. Animals exposed to random punishment eventually stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. The brain learns that effort does not correlate with reward. It conserves energy by surrendering initiative. Societies experience the same effect. When education no longer guarantees opportunity, effort no longer predicts advancement, and integrity no longer ensures security, people disengage. They stop planning. They stop striving. They lower ambitions. They retreat into immediate pleasures and short horizons. This disengagement looks like laziness. It is despair. Without explanation, agency erodes. The fifth symptom is identity fragmentation. Most identities are anchored in narratives of causality. I am who I am because of where I came from. I am going where I am going because of what I do. These stories connect past, present, and future. When explanations fail, temporal continuity weakens. People no longer understand how their past produced their present, or how their present will shape their future. Life becomes episodic. Moments disconnect. Experience feels accidental. This fragmentation produces a subtle alienation. People feel detached from their own lives. They describe themselves as observers rather than participants. They speak of time slipping, of years vanishing, of decisions feeling unreal. Existence loses narrative thickness. This stage, the psychological cost becomes existential. Without explanations, suffering becomes meaningless. Pain can be endured if it is purposeful. Sacrifice can be justified if it leads somewhere. Loss can be integrated if it fits a story. But when suffering appears random, unjustified, and unconnected, it corrodes dignity. People begin asking dangerous questions. Why try? Why care? Why endure? These are not philosophical inquiries. They are survival thresholds. Civilizations rarely collapse from external threats. They collapse when enough individuals silently decide that coherence is no longer available. Yet the most subtle cost remains. It is the erosion of trust in perception itself. When explanations fail repeatedly, people stop trusting not only authorities, but their own understanding. They doubt their judgments. They second-guess interpretations. They hesitate to form conclusions. They outsource thinking to groups, algorithms, or charismatic figures. This weakens autonomy. A person uncertain of their own perception becomes easy to influence, easy to frighten, easy to mobilize, easy to pacify. Thus, epistemic deprivation becomes political, not by design but by consequence. A population unable to explain its world is a population vulnerable to any narrative that offers relief. This is why explanation has always been power. Religions governed through cosmology. Empires ruled through destiny. States control through ideology. Corporations persuade through branding. Explanations organize behavior. When official explanations dissolve, unofficial powers rush in. Yet there is a deeper layer beneath all of this. The mind does not merely want explanation, it wants closure. Open-ended uncertainty is psychologically toxic. The brain evolved in environments where ambiguity resolved quickly. A predator appears or disappears. A storm arrives or passes. A rival attacks or retreats. Modern ambiguity persists indefinitely. Crises stretch for years. Narratives never conclude. Threats never fully vanish. The nervous system remains suspended. This suspension alters personality at scale. Risk tolerance declines. Novelty becomes threatening. Empathy narrows. Time horizons shrink. People prefer familiar suffering to uncertain improvement. Innovation slows not because creativity dies, but because fear dominates. This is the hidden stagnation of explanation-free societies. They appear dynamic, noisy, hyperactive, but internally, they freeze. Yet within this bleak landscape lies a difficult truth. The problem is not merely that explanations have failed, It is that we demanded too much from them. For centuries, humans believed explanation could deliver certainty, control, progress, and salvation. Science would master nature. Economics would engineer prosperity. Psychology would decode behavior. Technology would eliminate risk. These promises were never realistic. Reality is not a puzzle with a final solution. It is a process with shifting constraints. Perhaps the psychological crisis we face is not the loss of explanation, but the collapse of the illusion that explanation could ever be complete. If so, the task is not to restore certainty. It is to relearn how to live with partial meaning. This requires a different mental posture, not prediction, but preparedness, not closure, but continuity, not grand narratives, but local coherence. The healthiest minds in uncertain eras are not those who find perfect explanations. They are those who construct working stories, stories flexible enough to update, humble enough to admit limits, stable enough to guide action. These individuals do not demand final answers. They cultivate orientation. They ask not, "Why is this happening?" but "What does this require of me now?" They accept that many forces exceed comprehension. They refuse to let uncertainty become paralysis. They build small zones of meaning inside large zones of chaos. This is not resignation. It is psychological sovereignty. For in a world without reliable explanations, the ultimate freedom is not knowing. It is remaining whole. When narratives collapse, the fragile mind fragments, but the disciplined mind adapts. It learns to carry ambiguity without panic, to endure uncertainty without nihilism, to act without guarantees. This is the quiet resilience of explanation-free lives, and it may be the defining psychological skill of the age to come. In times of upheaval, people crave clarity. The world has become unpredictable, complex, and overwhelming. Patterns fail, predictions collapse, institutions hesitate. The void left by uncertainty is deep, disorienting, and profoundly uncomfortable. Human psychology cannot tolerate this vacuum for long. Minds yearn for direction, for explanation, for a sense of cause and effect, even if the explanation is wrong. In such conditions, false certainty rises. False certainty is seductive because it promises the comfort that reality no longer delivers. It offers narratives that explain chaos, identify culprits, and prescribe action with unwavering confidence. Unlike genuine expertise, which is tentative and provisional, false certainty projects decisiveness, mastery, and inevitability. It is certainty without accountability. It is confidence without understanding, and it spreads faster than truth. The rise of false certainty is not new, but its scale and velocity are unprecedented. Previous eras, misinformation spread slowly, limited by geography, literacy, and communication technology. Today, digital networks amplify every claim instantly, giving it the aura of legitimacy. Algorithms reward confidence, engagement, and simplicity, often at the expense of accuracy. False certainty is both visible and viral, while nuanced truth is slow, conditional, and easily misinterpreted. False certainty thrives because human cognition has biases built in to prefer decisiveness over doubt. The mind interprets confidence as competence. A bold statement is remembered, a cautious one is ignored. People trust those who speak clearly, even if their claims are flawed. In environments where uncertainty is the default, certainty, even false certainty, feels like salvation. It is psychologically adaptive, if not intellectually honest. Yet this adaptation is dangerous. The first danger is that false certainty crowds out expertise. When the public encounters two voices, one cautious, nuanced, and accurate, the other confident, simplistic, and wrong, they often choose the latter. This is not stupidity, but a consequence of evolved heuristics. Clarity is easier to process than complexity. Boldness is easier to follow than hesitation. Experts who acknowledge limits or revise positions are perceived as weak, while those who assert absolute knowledge dominate discourse. False certainty also reshapes social hierarchies. Authority shifts from those who know to those who perform knowing. Leaders, pundits, influencers, and commentators succeed not because of insight, but because of confidence. The more complex the system, the more valuable performance becomes relative to substance. Systems reward the appearance of mastery over its reality. Those who play the role of certainty rise, while those who actually possess it are marginalized. This inversion is both political and cultural. Politically, it produces leaders who claim understanding but lack competence, who assert moral clarity while failing in practice, and who simplify complexity into slogans. Populism thrives on false certainty. It promises solutions to problems that cannot be simplified, certainty in contexts that resist it. People do not follow because the solutions work. They follow because they feel safe in believing that the solutions exist. Culturally, false certainty encourages ideological rigidity. Groups form around certainty, not evidence. Belief becomes identity. Dissent is treated as betrayal. Debate is abandoned in favor of conviction. Complexity is compressed into binaries, right and wrong, us and them, truth and lies. Nuance, hesitation, and doubt are treated as moral failings rather than cognitive necessities. This fosters polarization, echo chambers, and groupthink. The second danger of false certainty is operational. Decisions made with conviction but without understanding can have catastrophic consequences. Financial markets are influenced by confident but uninformed actors. Public health policies are driven by vocal but inaccurate authorities. Social media amplifies misinformation with real-world repercussions. Unlike ordinary error, which is correctable through feedback, false certainty propagates rapidly, entrenches belief, and multiplies impact. It is not merely wrong, it is contagious. False certainty also undermines the very mechanisms by which societies validate truth. Scientific method relies on doubt, revision, peer review, and experimentation. Journalism depends on investigation, corroboration, and transparency. Governance depends on oversight, deliberation, and accountability. When false certainty dominates, these systems are devalued. Expertise is distrusted. Nuance is ridiculed. Revision is treated as betrayal. Performance replaces verification. The social infrastructure of truth collapses under the weight of perception. Perhaps the most insidious danger is psychological. False certainty creates overconfidence in the wrong direction. People act decisively, energetically, and aggressively, but toward false ends. Misplaced action carries the same emotional reward as justified action, reinforcing belief in accuracy. Confidence is reinforced not by results, but by the psychological comfort of feeling correct. In other words, people are rewarded internally for being wrong. This feedback loop entrenches false certainty, making it self-sustaining. Moreover, false certainty thrives on fear. Uncertainty produces anxiety. Anxiety motivates people to seek solutions, even imperfect ones. Charismatic actors exploit this fear, offering clarity in exchange for trust, allegiance, or obedience. The more threatening the world appears, the more powerful the illusion of certainty becomes. Fear accelerates adoption, compliance, and propagation of false narratives. It converts desperation into loyalty, curiosity into conformity, and confusion into ideological rigidity. False certainty is also selective. It is most potent where knowledge is scarce and stakes are high. In areas beyond everyday experience, economics, geopolitics, climate science, medicine, people are more likely to defer to confident voices. The combination of complexity, opacity, and urgency creates a fertile ground for false authority. The less we understand a domain, the more we rely on projection, performance, and social proof to guide belief. Confidence substitutes for competence. Certainty substitutes for evidence. The consequences of false certainty are cumulative. Each act of misplaced trust strengthens the incentive for more performance over substance. Systems that reward confident error attract individuals who excel at performing correctness rather than achieving it. Institutions that amplify visibility over verification lose their ability to coordinate reality. Societies become progressively less capable of distinguishing truth from persuasion, skill from performance, and insight from theater. Over time, false certainty reshapes norms. Hesitation becomes stigmatized. Revision is disdained. Nuance is punished. Complexity is compressed into slogans. Those who resist, question, or doubt are marginalized as weak, cowardly, or unpatriotic. This produces a social environment in which everyone is pressured to project certainty, regardless of internal understanding. The majority adapt, performing confidence while privately uncertain. A minority genuinely possess expertise but remain silent to avoid reputational risk. This dynamic has profound implications for survival. Decisions, policies, and innovations increasingly reflect the performance of certainty rather than the reality it purports to represent. Failures are often spectacular because they originate not in ignorance, but in confident misdirection, amplified by networks of trust and visibility. The world becomes a place where confidence, not competence, dictates action. The stakes of error escalate because error is no longer isolated, it is systemically amplified. Yet false certainty is resilient. It is psychologically and socially sticky. Humans prefer comforting stories over ambiguity. Societies prefer decisive leaders over hesitant advisors. Systems reward quick action over careful analysis. Even when exposed, false certainty can survive because admitting error threatens social cohesion, status, and identity. The illusion persists because the cost of dismantling it exceeds the immediate benefit. Awareness of false certainty does not inoculate against it. Recognizing the problem can generate cynicism or paralysis, but does not automatically produce corrective behavior. In many cases, it reinforces adaptation. People mimic the appearance of certainty to avoid disadvantage. The feedback loop of performance becomes entrenched, self-reinforcing, and generational. Societies socialize individuals into projecting confidence, even in the absence of understanding, perpetuating cycles of error. The rise of false certainty is not a temporary anomaly. It is a structural phenomenon in modern, complex, and hyper-connected societies. The very speed, visibility, and interconnectedness that accelerate knowledge dissemination also accelerate the propagation of conviction divorced from competence. In such environments, certainty is currency, persuasion is power, and narrative often outweighs reality. Systems no longer reward truth, they reward the performance of truth. The antidote is neither simple nor comforting. It cannot rely solely on more education, better regulation, or stricter oversight. These measures address symptoms but not dynamics. The deeper solution lies in cultivating the capacity to recognize uncertainty, tolerate ambiguity, and value provisional knowledge. It requires rewarding humility alongside competence, curiosity alongside conviction, and adaptability alongside authority. It requires building social norms that respect doubt as a form of insight rather than weakness. At an individual level, navigating false certainty requires psychological discipline. One must learn to distinguish internal confidence from external performance, to trust evidence over narrative, and to resist the seductive pull of simplicity in complex domains. It requires patience, vigilance, and a commitment to critical thinking, even when inconvenient. This is not optimism, it is strategic survival. The danger of false certainty is profound because it is contagious, self-reinforcing, and systemically integrated. It exploits cognitive biases, social networks, and institutional incentives. It thrives on fear, complexity, and urgency. It displaces expertise, distorts action, and erodes trust. And, perhaps most dangerously, it is not easily recognized by those immersed in it. Confidence feels real, conviction feels justified, and performance feels equivalent to competence. False certainty, in short, is civilization's quiet poison. It is the illusion of control in a world too complex to master. It seduces the anxious, amplifies error, and reshapes societies in its image. Yet it also offers lessons in recognizing it, resisting it, and cultivating humility and resilience. Individuals and societies may regain some stability in an otherwise unstable world. The challenge is immense, the stakes existential, and the path uncertain, but awareness remains the first defense. In the era of inverted incentives, rapid information, and epistemic overload, false certainty will dominate unless humans consciously rebuild the relationship between confidence and competence, narrative and evidence, persuasion and truth. It is not merely a moral or intellectual failure, it is a structural, psychological, and systemic phenomenon. And until it is addressed, the price of certainty will continue to be paid, not in comfort, but in catastrophe. The world has flipped. What once seemed stable now wavers. Authority falters, rules invert, explanations disappear. False certainty dominates. Complexity accelerates beyond comprehension. In such a landscape, survival is no longer about mastery of external systems. It is about mastering oneself. To endure, to act, to thrive, one must learn to stand upright in a world that offers no handrails, no guideposts, no guarantees. Standing upright is not metaphorical. It is practical, psychological, and moral. It requires cultivating an internal orientation capable of withstanding external turbulence. When reality no longer obeys rules, when predictions fail, when outcomes defy logic, those who cling to external frameworks will be unmoored. Those who construct internal frameworks, discipline, perception, judgment, and resilience will endure. The first lesson of standing upright is clarity of self. Inverted systems reward noise over thought, spectacle over substance, speed over depth. 2. Resist. One must understand which traits are essential to survival and which are expendable in adaptation. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every trend is worth following. Internal clarity allows discernment between ephemeral chaos and enduring principles. It is a mental compass in a terrain where maps have disappeared. Clarity of self requires reflection. It demands identifying the values, skills, and truths that form a personal anchor. What guides your decisions when norms collapse? What defines integrity when public morality is performative? What constitutes competence when expertise is dismissed? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because the answers are provisional and personal, not socially validated. Yet they are the foundation of internal stability. The second lesson is discipline in action. In a world where external rules fail, internal rules become paramount. Discipline is not obedience to others. It is adherence to one's own principles and processes. It manifests in thought, behavior, and attention. Daily routines, deliberate study, and measured decision-making are acts of resistance against chaos. Discipline allows action even when the environment is unpredictable, and it prevents surrender to the seductive but destructive incentives of inversion. Discipline is closely linked to deliberate learning. In uncertain systems, reactive knowledge is inadequate. One must cultivate observation, analysis, and adaptability simultaneously. Learning is not merely acquiring facts, it is refining judgment. It is discerning patterns in complexity without assuming finality. It is practicing the skill of updating beliefs without being paralyzed by doubt, and acting decisively without being seduced by false certainty. The third lesson is emotional regulation. The psychological cost of uncertainty is real. Anxiety, fatigue, disorientation, and alienation. To stand upright, one must manage emotions without suppressing them. Fear can be a signal, not a command. Anger can illuminate boundaries, not dictate action. Patience becomes a survival strategy. Emotional regulation allows thought to function clearly under stress, preserving judgment and maintaining the composure necessary for strategic action. Closely tied to emotional regulation is the cultivation of resilience. Resilience is not endurance alone. It is adaptability without losing coherence. It is the ability to bend without breaking, to absorb shocks without shattering, to navigate reversals without surrendering principles. Inversion, false certainty, and epistemic collapse are tests of resilience. Those who survive do not avoid disruption, they incorporate it, learn from it, and adjust while maintaining integrity. The fourth lesson is selective engagement with the world. In a landscape of noise and inversion, it is impossible to engage meaningfully with every signal. One must learn to filter, prioritize, and allocate attention strategically. Not every opinion, event, or narrative requires a response. Not every crisis demands intervention. Strategic engagement preserves cognitive and emotional energy, allowing focus on areas where action can produce real effect rather than being consumed by performative conflict or manipulated narratives. Standing upright also demands a relationship with truth that is both humble and active. Absolute certainty is rare, and chasing it relentlessly can be paralyzing. Yet surrendering entirely to skepticism leads to nihilism. The upright individual balances humility with active inquiry. They accept uncertainty while striving for understanding. They acknowledge limits while testing boundaries, and they maintain integrity even when external validation is absent. Truth is a process, not a product. It is navigated, not possessed. The fifth lesson is the cultivation of autonomy. In inverted systems, reliance on authority can be perilous. When experts hesitate, when institutions falter, when public narratives deceive, Individuals must make decisions based on their own analysis and judgment. Autonomy is not isolation. It is the capacity to evaluate evidence, anticipate consequences, and act responsibly even when guidance is absent. It is the ability to construct temporary frameworks of understanding and adapt them as conditions evolve. Autonomy requires courage, not bravado. It demands the willingness to act despite incomplete knowledge, to bear consequences of uncertainty, and to resist social pressure that rewards false certainty. Autonomy also requires accountability, recognizing that actions have consequences not only externally but internally, shaping character, habit, and perception. The sixth lesson is community without dependency. No one thrives entirely alone, and no one survives entirely through social networks that prioritize noise over truth. The upright individual builds relationships that are mutually reinforcing, not performatively validating. Communities can provide perspective, support, and challenge, but they must not dictate judgment. Wise engagement balances collaboration with critical independence. The goal is symbiosis, not conformity. Finally, standing upright entails temporal perspective. In a world dominated by immediate feedback, spectacle, and volatility, the upright individual cultivates patience. Long-term horizons provide stability amidst short-term chaos. Even when external systems invert, slow processes, character development, skill acquisition, reflection remain powerful. A sense of time allows one to act decisively today without being enslaved to the ephemeral whims of noise or social theater. These lessons taken together form the architecture of resilience. They are not guarantees of success nor shields against suffering. They are defenses against disorientation, erosion, and surrender. To stand upright is to assert agency in the absence of certainty. It is to act deliberately in a world that has lost its guarantees. It is to maintain coherence where the external order is incoherent. Yet standing upright is not merely reactive, it is creative. It requires constructing meaning within chaos, building order without total control, and cultivating mastery of self when mastery of the world is impossible. Those who succeed do not wait for external systems to restore clarity. They generate it internally. They navigate rather than command. They endure rather than triumph immediately. In many ways, standing upright is the ultimate inversion of the era. While the world rewards spectacle, it values substance in crisis. While the world punishes depth, it cannot function without reflection. While false certainty dominates, genuine discernment becomes scarce and indispensable. The virtues required to thrive in the collapse of traditional hierarchies are subtle, internal, and invisible, but they are the only tools that guarantee true resilience. The challenge is immense because the world is relentless. Complexity continues to accelerate. Systems remain unstable. False certainty persists. Inversion dominates many domains. Explanations remain scarce. Yet these challenges are not insurmountable. Humans are adaptive. Minds are capable of constructing internal frameworks. Habits, reflection, discipline, and resilience can stabilize cognition even when external reality destabilizes. The upright individual is not naive. They are prepared. Ultimately, standing upright is an act of agency and defiance. It is the refusal to collapse psychologically when the environment collapses epistemically. It is the conscious decision to maintain integrity, focus, and clarity, even when the world seems to reward the opposite. It is not perfection, but endurance. Not dominance, but orientation. Not control, but sovereignty of the mind. The world has turned over, and chaos reigns. But chaos is not absolute. Within it, the individual who cultivates clarity, discipline, emotional regulation, resilience, autonomy, and perspective can navigate uncertainty with stability. Such a person does not merely survive, they stand upright. And standing upright in a world that has lost its rules is itself an act of power, presence, and wisdom. In a civilization where authority falters, rules invert, certainty is false, and explanations vanish, standing upright is the last frontier. It is the locus of stability, judgment, and adaptability. It is a personal civilization amid social collapse. It is the practice of internal sovereignty when external systems fail. And it is the only way to endure. not as a victim of inversion, but as a conscious agent navigating its reality. Those who master this art do not expect the world to right itself. They understand that external order may never fully return. Their survival depends not on predicting reality, but on cultivating the internal architecture that allows life to continue coherently within it. In this way, the inverted world, chaotic and unpredictable, becomes not a prison, but a terrain to navigate. Standing upright is not triumph over the world, it is mastery over oneself. And it is from this mastery that resilience, clarity, and enduring influence arise.